Okay, so Essie, welcome. Thank you so very much. It looks like we are now set to go.
Great. Thanks so much, Rocky and Mandy. Hi, y'all. My name is Essie Shachar Hill. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Chicago Education and Training Manager for Keshet. If you don't know what half of those things I just said mean, don't worry, you will soon. And I'm really pleased to be here with you all, this morning. Full disclosure, I'm still waking up. I'm still drinking my coffee. So if you're in the same place, it's all good. And I have been working with Beth Tikva congregation for a while, working with some of the folks on this call who are actually part of a year-long sort of consulting project with Keshet, working on policy and programming and culture, and it's been really exciting, and I've been just so heartened to see all the amazing work that your organization is doing. And as was already mentioned, I've done a wonderful program with your teens. I did a program in maybe January, back before when we could be in person together with the community and some of the folks also I recognize on this call. And now I'm really pleased to be here with you all as teachers. Can I just see a quick show of hands, like by putting your hand close to the camera, if you've been in one of my trainings before? So not necessarily the teen one, but okay, great. Okay, that's really helpful. We do have some new material today, so it will not be the same. And I want to get started in just a second, but I just want to let you know of one other very important person on this call, who is my wonderful colleague, Dubs. Dubs, do you want to introduce yourself really briefly?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Dubs Weinblatt. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the Associate Director of Education and Training for Metro New York for Keshet. And I'm really excited to be here with you all. I'm the tech person. And so if you have any questions, please send me a chat. If you have other questions that aren't tech related, but are LGBTQ related, feel free to put those in the chat as well. And I'm happy to answer those. One quick request is I don't have access to breakout rooms yet. So whoever is the host, if you could please make me the host so I can create the breakout rooms for one of the pieces of the training, that would be amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. All right, can folks see that presentation? Yes, great. Okay, still getting used to things being all online. All right, so this is what we're here to talk about today: building communities of LGBTQ equality and belonging. This is me. So again, my name is Essie Shachar Hill. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. More on this later. I'm a licensed social worker. I've been working for Keshet for about over 2 years now in the Chicagoland area with lots of organizations and Jewish institutions around the area on being more LGBTQ inclusive. So Keshet, just very briefly, Keshet is the national organization working for LGBTQ equality in Jewish life. You may be familiar with another Keshet, another wonderful Keshet in the area. It can get a little bit confusing, so I just like to differentiate. We are a totally different Keshet than the local Keshet that works with folks with disabilities, which I am, you probably have relationships with too as a religious school. So this is a totally different organization. We just happen to share that same fabulous name. Keshet means rainbow. So you can see maybe why we both liked the idea of having a beautiful spectrum as our kind of name. So Keshet is based in Boston, but we're a national organization. We have staff in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and all over the country. We have an education and training department, which is the team that I'm on, and we do presentations like this and work with institutions and professionals and leaders. We also have a teen department that runs wonderful teen programming all year round. Right now that's looking like online programming, but it's really a beautiful space for LGBTQ and ally teens, Jewish teens, to have a very specific safe space, currently online, but sometimes in person. And we also have a community mobilization department that works on signing on to political campaigns and sort of mobilizing the Jewish community. So those are our three main pieces. And again, we're here to, on behalf of the education team. All right, so we wanted to start by just thinking through sort of what is Jewish about this work. So Keshet is a specifically Jewish organization. We only work within the Jewish community around LGBTQ equality and inclusion. And so we are based squarely in Jewish values. And we think that there's nothing really more core to the Jewish tradition than uplifting the inherent dignity and worth of every person. And that is going to contribute to greater justice and equality in our world and in our communities. So we just start with this quote from Genesis, and God created the human in God's image. This is one of our sort of core tenets that we talk about at Keshet. B'Tselem Elohim, we are all made in God's image. So while humanity is beautifully diverse and everybody is different and has different experiences and expressions, we're all made in the divine image, and so we all deserve to be treated as such. And we hope that today's presentation will sort of give you some more tools and equip you to help create a community in which everybody feels like they are made in the divine image and they are worth the human dignity and respect. So before we jump into it, these are our goals for today. So the first is identify and understand the core terms and concepts related to LGBTQ identity, make connections between LGBTQ equality and Jewish values, and identify a framework for building towards LGBTQ equality and belonging in your community. So I want to just uplift something from that last point. I'm not necessarily going to provide you with a laundry list of best practices of like all the things that you should do. I will provide some of those things, but more what I'm going to do is provide you with a framework so that you can take the tools that you learned today and apply them on your own. And the reason that we kind of come at it from that angle is this work is always changing and this language is always changing. And so it feels like any list we could give you would, one, be incomplete, and two, would also be ever evolving. And so we really want to kind of zoom out and give you the tools that will adapt as the world adapts and as your situations adapt. Okay, and then one more piece before we jump in, some kavanot, some intentions. You may already have some in this space. If so, I would love to add any into the room. But the ones that I have for our time together are to stay open to new ideas. So some of the things we talk about today might be new, might be a little uncomfortable. As much as you can, just try and keep an open heart and an open mind. Take space, make space. So just think about how much space you're taking up. If you're someone who likes to make a lot of comments after everything and you feel you're taking up a lot of space, maybe just pull back a little bit to make space for other beautiful voices in the room. If you're someone who's feeling a little bit shy and tends to not speak up, maybe push yourself to take up a little bit more space and contribute. So it says take lessons and leave stories. This is about confidentiality. So we absolutely want you to take lessons, take what you have learned here and apply it. However, specific stories, specific identifying information, particularly if other people share in this space, sensitive or personal information, just leave those specifics here so that everyone can maintain their confidentiality. And I also want to note, we are recording, so that also may impact what you choose to share. So just be aware of that we will try and make this as, confidential of a space as reasonably possible with all of those things said. Welcome imperfection and learning. So you don't have to be perfect in this space. I am not perfect in this space. I do not expect you to be perfect in this space. So this is a place for us to learn. And in order for learning to happen, mistakes have to happen too. So don't feel like you have to know all the words or know exactly how to ask your question. We can kind of work through it together, and it's okay to stumble over these things. That's exactly what we're here for. And I would just encourage you to help me make that space where it's okay to ask those uncomfortable questions and mess up sometimes. The next one is intent versus impact. So just be aware that you might say something, you might ask something that you don't mean to be hurtful or harmful, but it might have that impact regardless. And that happens sometimes. So this bullet point is sort of about being open to feedback. Like if you ask a question in a certain way, I might say, could we think about that word and maybe use this other word, because maybe you intended it to be very, innocuous, and maybe it could have had a hurtful impact on someone in the space. And so this is just about, again, it's okay to make mistakes and be imperfect. And this one is just about being open to hearing that. Stay present as much as possible. So it's really hard to be present. At least I find it very hard to be present on the internet for so long. I know that you all are coming from a section of your meeting before this. So do what you need to do to stay present. Maybe that's turning off your ringer on your phone. Maybe that's putting your loud cat in the other room. I don't know what it is. But if there's one thing that you can do to help be present for the next 90 minutes, feel free to take a moment to do that. And also, I recognize you're maybe in your home, you have other responsibilities, kids might come in at a certain point, you might need to get up and do something, take care of yourself. I trust you to take care of your needs, we're all adults here. And lastly, have fun. So it's not all so serious, you can laugh at my jokes, we'll have fun together. Are there any questions on any of these, or additional intentions or ground rules that people want to add to this space before we keep going? All right, let's keep going then. So we're going to start with a small activity in breakout rooms. So in just a few minutes, you'll get a little invitation on your screen to go into a breakout room, and you'll be with one, maybe two other people. And the idea is to talk for a few moments about a moment when you felt full belonging, like you fully belonged in a place exactly as you are. And what I'm talking about is in a communal setting, sort of in an organization or in a group, not like when you get home at the end of the day and your spouse is like, honey, I'm so glad you're home, and you feel full belonging. I'm talking more about in an organizational or a group or a communal context. So a moment that you felt like you really belonged somewhere. And what did that feel like? How did you know that you were welcome? How did that influence your experience of the community? Those are some more questions to elicit some discussion, but just talking about a moment that you felt full belonging in an organization or in a group. And you're gonna have 6 minutes total, so that's 3 minutes per person. Any questions on the prompt, on breakout rooms? All right, so Dubs, if you're ready, you can send people into their rooms. We'll see you back in 6 minutes. Great, so welcome back from the magical breakout room. Oh, we have some new faces, hi. Great, so I would love to hear from a couple people. How was that? If you wanna share maybe something you talked about around this question of belonging, a time that you felt true belonging and how you knew that you felt that.
Well, yeah, so I had the privilege of sharing the breakout room with Rabbi Tapman. And I think we had some similar experiences as far as feeling a sense of belonging, especially in a Jewish, maybe even more so in a Jewish realm than outside of it. There are just things we can say and can't say that will be more better understood in a Jewish environment than outside of a Jewish environment. Words we can drop without thinking that we need to translate them, and ideas too. And so that, I think we share that in common. And for me, I said in meetings like this, the faculty meetings, I've been a member of Beth Tickford's faculty since 1973. And so it feels sort of like home. I mean, you said not mentioning, when you get home, and that's obvious. So maybe it's obvious to everybody else that I feel that way, usually among the faculty groups, though sometimes there's some new people each year, but eventually we know each other, and I definitely feel I get positive vibes and also positive words, which I'm very lucky to hear from time to time from folks. So what could be better?
Thank you, Scott. That was so beautiful. So I heard, you know, things about hearing positive words that tell you that you belong and are welcome here. I heard something around having a similar experience with folks in this space and knowing that you will be understood, and also not having to translate your experience. I mean, literally not maybe having to translate some Hebrew words, but also I think that applies more generally of not really having to explain your experience because people around you just get it. So thank you so much. That's really wonderful. Anyone else want to share what they talked about in their small group? Yeah, Ellen.
Lucy and I were together, and Lucy and I are both full-time staff at the temple. Lucy's been there a very long time. And Lucy used the word while we were discussing community. And I think that's one of the things that we've always talked about Beth Tikva, that it is a community that cares and respects and is there for each other. And it's been proved time and time again how much we do care and do for each other when people need it. And that's what a community or a family, because it is a second family, does for each other.
Thank you. I saw some yeses, other people agreed. Great. Final thoughts, things that haven't been said around what contributes for you personally around this sense of belonging and welcoming in a space? I think it's so cool that we got, hi Deb. I think it's so cool that we got 2 examples around Beth Tikva congregation. That's very cool. Deb, did you want to add something? You're muted.
Oh, no, I'm sorry if I made
okay.
it seem like I did.
Oh, anyway, I just wanted, Alana and I were together, and you know, one of the things we said a lot, but not all of it's relevant here, I don't think. But one of the things that I think Alana spoke to, and also about Beth Tikva, was that we feel that at Beth Tikva, one of our strengths is we're very good about accepting people for who they are and what they have to contribute. That we recognize that, you know, there's all different. We are a pretty not a monolithic congregation. We're a pretty heterogeneous congregation, and that there's people that have all different levels of commitment and different skills and talents, and we're pretty good at trying to recognize that and accept people for what they have to contribute and appreciate that.
Great. Thank you. So I hear sort of meeting people where they are and accepting all different kinds of people with all different kinds of experience, which is a great segue into what we're talking about today. So the reason, maybe it's obvious, but the reason that we started with some reflection on belonging is so you can really hold on to that sense of what does it feel like to feel really like you belong in a space. And I hope that everybody had an example from their lives for a space that felt like that. You know, not everybody does have a space that feels like that. And what we're talking about today around LGBTQ inclusion and creating a sense of belonging for LGBTQ people is really important. Just as Deb said, you know, Beth Tikva congregation strives to meet people where they are and accept all different kinds of people. That includes folks who are different from you and the same as you and who you don't totally understand, potentially. And so we're going to be talking about some of those things today. And just as much as you can, hold on to that feeling of that thing that you shared, around having a space where you felt like you belonged, because that is so crucial, and as we'll see later, can be life-saving, actually, particularly when it comes to our young people. So I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so we're going to start with some terms and concepts, what I call LGBTQ alphabet. So figuring out these letters, what they mean, all the concepts, and what they mean. So before we dive in, I just want to say a few things about this section. First of all, once again, I'm not going to give you a complete list of every single identity out there and every single word that you might hear. There's this wonderful thing called Google that you can use if you come across a word that you don't know or that we haven't talked about today. And there's lots of resources out there, some of which Keshet has created, which we can share with you. But we're going to be sharing some of the big framework pieces around LGBTQ identities and some of the common words that you might hear. And I also want to say some of the definitions I'm going to give you are sort of my working definitions, but different people will give you different definitions because a lot of these identities and labels are really personal. Similarly to if I asked everyone in the space, like, what does it mean to be a Jew to you if you identify as being Jewish, we would get like 50 different answers, and there's only 25 people in this space, right? So again, I'm going to give you my working definitions, but these are not written in stone because this language is always changing and evolving. So before we dive right into the terms and concepts, I want to get a little bit of a temperature check for people who have been in my trainings before. You'll notice this is different, so buckle up. So this is a little graphic of the life cycle of an oak tree. So we're going to use this metaphor to think about where each of us is in terms of our learning around LGBTQ stuff. So it starts with a seed, and then it turns into a little sprout, and then it's a sapling, and then it's a mature oak. And a mature oak actually doesn't stop growing, it keeps growing. So there is not like an end point to this process. And a mature oak also produces seeds. So when we're extending our metaphor, we think like a mature oak is also educating and advocating and kind of moving that ball forward. So if you can think to yourself around like your own level of knowledge around LGBTQ stuff, do you think you're a seed? So right at the beginning, are you a sprout? Are you a sapling? Are you a mature oak? And Debs is going to put this in the chat of a 1, 2, 3, or a 4. And if you can just, if you're comfortable, just dropping in the chat a number, 1, 2, 3, or a 4, depending on where you are in your own level of knowledge around LGBTQ stuff. Great, so 3s, I see a 4, 3s. Great, don't be shy if you're a 1 or a 2, you can put that in there, absolutely. Great, lots of 3s, lots of saplings, 2, 3, 3.5, great. Great, feel free to keep dropping those numbers in there. It sounds like people are kind of intermediate, so we may breeze right through this section. We'll see how it goes. 2, great. Alrighty, so I'm gonna start with this graphic, which some of you have seen. It's a triangle, each of the corners are labeled. The top is labeled sex assigned at birth, one is labeled gender identity, and one is labeled sexual orientation. So these are 3 different dimensions of a person. These are 3 separate categories, and everyone in this space, all of us here, have all 3 of these things. So we each have a sex assigned at birth, a gender identity, and a sexual orientation. Some of us might think about these parts of ourselves more than others, depending on what group we're a part of, but we all have all 3. And the reason we start with this diagram is to really tease apart the fact that these are distinct categories. They can often get conflated, and if you're out in the world, sometimes people mix them up and use, you know, a word from this category to describe that category, and it gets really confusing. And so this is really just to start by saying 3 separate dimensions: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, sexual orientation, and we're going to go through one by one now and talk about what each of these means. Oh, but first, I also want to make a note that those are not the only dimensions of a person, right? So there's an image here that has a lot of other identities that are all contributing to a person. So things like race, age, ethnicity, culture, language, all these things also contribute to people, and these are all really important, and they all intersect and influence people in different ways. So we include this just to remind us that we're whole people, and we have more than just these 3 identities, but these 3 identities are sort of the ones that we're going to start focusing on first. And someone has entered the waiting room. Okay, they've been admitted. Great. Okay, so we're going to start with the top identity or the top category, which is sex assigned at birth. So in the society, often when a baby is born, or maybe before a baby is born and there's an ultrasound or something, the doctor or the nurse or the doula or the midwife looks sort of at what's between a baby's legs and makes a determination based on what that person sees. So that baby might be assigned male or female or intersex at birth. And those things are really based on genitalia, hormones, chromosomes, really kind of biological, scientific sorts of things. So just to clarify, intersex is the condition of being born with characteristics that are not strictly male or strictly female. The antiquated word for this is hermaphrodite. We no longer use that word. The word now is intersex. There's lots and lots of different ways to be born intersex, and it's sometimes identified at birth and sometimes later, but it is around physical characteristics in the body, and so that's why it's characterized under sex assigned at birth, because it's just like from what one sees on a body. All right, moving along, another category we have is gender identity. So gender identity is an internal identity. It's like in your heart, in your gut, in your kishkas, who you know yourself to be, whether that's maybe some of the words up here are a woman or man or non-binary or genderqueer. These are internal sort of senses of who you are. So you wake up in the morning, who are you? How do you know who you are in terms of your gender? It's a felt sense. So it's actually not based on what kind of body you have. It's about a felt sense. So up here we have words like woman. My sort of silly definition for you as a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. I know it's not super helpful, but it's sort of the only one I can give you, because to be a woman, you don't have to have a certain haircut. You don't have to be yay high, right? You don't have to look a certain way. You don't even have to have a certain kind of body. One who knows herself and her kishkas and her heart and her gut to be a woman is a woman. So I give you that definition to kind of reiterate that it's about an internal felt sense as opposed to body parts. So we have woman, we have man, we have non-binary up here. So I'll just really briefly define binary before we can do non-binary. So binary meaning coming from two, bi. Binary genders are man and woman. So the gender binary is the system of thinking that there are two genders, man and woman, and those are the only two options. Like there's kind of two boxes and everybody fits into those two boxes. That's the gender binary. So non-binary is a gender identity that says, actually, I see those two boxes. I see man, I see woman, but actually I'm neither. I'm non-binary. I'm not part of this system. I'm something else entirely. So that's non-binary, someone who does not consider themselves a man or a woman. Gender queer, we're going to come back to in a couple slides. Gender fluid is somebody who feels that their gender is fluid. So maybe they feel more feminine one day, more masculine another day, maybe don't have a gender another day. It's in flux, it's kind of moving. It's not a fixed point in the way that some of these other ones might feel like a fixed point.
I have a question. Can you please help me understand the difference between gender fluid and non-binary?
Great question. Okay, the difference between gender fluid and non-binary. Great, so this is where we get into the minutia, and different people with these identities will give you different answers for the definition. I think the main difference here is gender fluid is more of a shifting thing, like that fluidity. This person might, it's hard to map out like how this person might look, because you don't have to look a certain way to hold these identities. But I think of non-binary as very much based in sort of rejection of a system in a certain way of like, I'm rejecting the gender binary, like I'm not a man and I'm not a woman. Someone who's gender fluid might sometimes feel like they're a man and sometimes feel like they're a woman and sometimes feel like they're something else. So it's sort of like playing within the gendered system. And again, if you ask someone who identifies as gender fluid, what does it mean to you to be gender fluid? They might give you a totally different answer. Or what does it mean to you to be non-binary? They might give you a totally different answer because they're very personal experiences.
Can I please reiterate what you said to maybe help myself understand?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to apologize for my ignorance, but I appreciate the opportunity. So if somebody says that they're non-binary, they're not going to necessarily, maybe, depending on who's defining it, going to attach themselves to either gender. But somebody who is gender fluid may attach themselves at one point to being a woman, or at one point being a man, or at one point being neither, and just I don't want to say travel, but a shift back and forth potentially. Did I?
That is one experience. Yep, that is
Okay.
one possibility for sure. And that, again, that might not be every single gender fluid person's experience,
Understood.
but that could be one way. And
Thank you
also,
for
I
allowing
wanna
me
say
that opportunity. I appreciate it.
Of course, and thank you for modeling sort of the vulnerability of asking these hard questions. I also want to say these words are not mutually exclusive. So someone might say, I am a gender fluid woman. You know, like I feel pretty close to this experience of womanhood, but also sometimes feel like other things, or like woman doesn't totally encapsulate who I am, right? So it can be used in conjunction with these other things. And I also, you brought up this great point of, again, like the purpose of this section is not so that we all leave with, you know, knowing exactly all these definitions or being able to define every single one. That's very much not the point. The point is so that we have sort of, first, so that we have some common language moving forward when we talk about how to apply these things and create a sense of belonging. And two, if you hear these identities of someone in your, you know, in your class says, oh yeah, you know, like as a gender fluid person, you sort of have an idea of what that word is, maybe some questions to ask or some things to Google later. So you're not totally like, what the heck did that person just say? So you have sort of a framework for that.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, I'm gonna keep moving. All right, so we just added 2 words onto this slide, and it's sort of about the relationship between sex assigned at birth and gender identity. So those 2 words that we added are cisgender and transgender. So I'm going to start with transgender. The T is bolded because that's the LGBT, that's the T in LGBTQ. So transgender refers to someone whose gender identity is different from the one they were assigned at birth. So I'll say that one more time. Transgender refers to someone whose gender identity is different from the one they were assigned at birth. So that is why it's in the sort of space connecting sex and gender, because it's about the relationship between those 2 categories. So for example, if there's a little baby born, the nurse looks and sees a penis between this baby's legs. This baby might be assigned male at birth. So male is a sex, but maybe this person grows up, has some experiences, gets to know themselves, you know, learns about the world, learns about themselves, and actually knows herself to be a girl. She says, I'm a girl. She might identify as a transgender girl or a transgender woman because her gender identity, girl or woman, is different from what she was assigned at birth. So that's transgender, when someone's gender identity is different from what they were assigned at birth. Cisgender, so a word that starts with a C that's up here, refers to someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender refers to someone whose gender identity aligns with the one they were assigned at birth. So if there's a little baby born, doctor looks between baby's legs, says, congratulations, it's a girl. And this girl grows up, knows herself to be a girl and then a woman. She identifies as a woman. She might identify as a cisgender woman because her gender identity, girl or woman, is the same as what she was assigned at birth. All right, with me? All right, we're gonna move on to the last corner here, which is sexual orientation, which is one that folks might be a little more familiar with. But we have things like straight, lesbian, bisexual, gay. The bolded letters indicate it's part of the acronym LGBTQ. So sexual orientation is about who we are attracted to, if we are attracted to other people, how we are attracted to other people, romantically, sexually, physically, things like that, who we are attracted to. So straight person might be like a man who's attracted to women, or women who are attracted to men. Lesbian might be women who are attracted to women. Gay might be men who are attracted to men, or, you know, people of all genders use gay. Pansexual refers to someone who is attracted to people regardless of their gender, so any gender. So it's who we are attracted to. We're going to talk about queer next. Okay, great. So queer, you'll see queer here twice. You'll see it over in sexual orientation, and you'll also see genderqueer over on gender identity. So queer is a reclaimed term, meaning it has historically been used as a slur, but has been kind of reclaimed, and the power has sort of been taken back. So I personally identify as queer, so you can call me queer because I have just told you that I'm queer. And my sort of working definition for you for queer, which is not perfect, but it's my working definition, is not straight. The thing about queer is that it's vague. It's purposefully vague. The reason I like queer as an identity, as a label, is that it allows me to not really be so much more specific. Like I can just tell you I'm queer, and that doesn't tell you really the genders of the people I'm attracted to or anything like that. It just tells you I'm part of the LGBTQ community. So some of these other words are a little bit more specific, which some people like and some people don't. And then now that we know a little bit more, I'll also say for queer, because it is a reclaimed term, there tends to be somewhat of a generational divide. So there are plenty of older folks who will not self-identify with this term and who do not like to be called this term because they have really painful, maybe even traumatic experiences and associations with this word from a time when it was used very differently than it is today. So like all these other words, identity words are ones that people get to choose for themselves, and that you can call people once they have called themselves that, because we all have a right to choose the words and experiences that best describe us. So then now that we know queer, jumping over back to gender for just one moment, genderqueer is sort of someone who is queer in their gender, someone who is queering gender. So again, some people might use this interchangeably with, gender fluid or non-binary. It will have slightly different nuances to people who hold that identity, but it's not man, it's not woman, it's its own sort of queering gender experience. I see a question in the chat about the difference between bisexual and pansexual. So bisexual and pansexual, some folks use them interchangeably. There's some nuance in the differentiation. So bi, as we've talked about with binary, bi means two. So for some people, bisexual means attracted to men and women. For some people, bisexual means attracted to two genders. And pansexual is about all genders. So they have some slight difference in connotation because it's about all as opposed to two. And that, gets to the question of how many genders are there, and there are limitless genders. Okay. Any questions before we keep going? I know this is a lot of information. All right. And if questions come up later, we can absolutely answer them. Okay. Let me just look at my notes. All right. I'm going to keep us moving. All right. So as we saw, maybe some of these things are a little bit more complicated than, or I'll speak for myself, than I was raised with, right? I was taught that things were much simpler than what we just talked about, but things are complicated. Identity is a big thing. How people experience the world and navigate the world is huge. And so of course it's not going to have a straight A to B trajectory, right? So any big questions that you've had in your life, what am I going to do? Where am I going to live? How am I going to live my life? I would be shocked if for anyone it looked like the first picture up here of a straight line, right? That would be, I would think, highly unusual. I think for most folks, it's much more of a journey. It's much more of ups and downs and figuring things out, and maybe not even in a, sort of two-dimensional graph like this. Maybe it's even more dynamic. But this is just a reminder that life is a journey, it's not a destination, and identity is the same way. So just a tad more on gender, because maybe, gender was just complicated for you a little bit more. I hope it was. So here are a couple things that we've talked about already and one that we have not. So the first is gender identity. There's a picture of a compass in someone's mind because gender identity lives in your brain, in your heart, and your gut. It's who you know yourself to be internally. In the middle is a picture of a famous cutie with the words gender expression underneath. So gender expression is about those external markers, things like haircut, clothes, mannerisms, maybe even the name we use, those external markers that we sometimes use to kind of express or to present our gender. So for people who have not been in my trainings before, if you have been, don't cheat. Does anybody know who this person is? Feel free to put it in the chat or come off mute if you have a guess of who this famous cutie is. Any guesses? It's okay if you're wrong. I need at least 2 guesses. Shirley Temple is one great guess. It is not Shirley Temple, but that's a great guess. Other guesses? Sometimes people have guessed Dolly Parton. It's not Dolly Parton. All right. I'm going to go ahead and spoil it. This is, okay, this is FDR, our former president, Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as a 4-ish-year-old. Okay, so I think this is so cute. I love his hair and his dress and his lacy little socks. I think they're so cute. I love this look. And I have this up here to remind us that so much of what we think about when we think about gender, things like haircut, right? Like a long hair and a dress is based in the society in which we live and the time in which we live, and that those things shift. So back when FDR was a little 4-year-old, this was the look for boys. This was the look for a professional portrait of a little boy, long hair, bangs, dress, all that. That was like boy. That was coded as boy. And today, a professional a professional portrait of a little boy might look pretty different, right? So again, just a reminder that so much of what we think about when we think about gender and what a little boy looks like and what a little girl looks like is simply based in the time and society in which we live and is not inherent in that person. So this is what people mean when they say gender is a social construct. This is exactly what they're talking about, is that it's not inherent that, you know, little boys will never wear dresses, right? That's clearly not inherent because FDR is here wearing a beautiful little dress. All right, and then the last picture up here is a cutie with a magnifying glass with gender attribution. So gender attribution is sort of what we have been trained to do when we look at a person and to take a guess at what their gender is. We're kind of taught to do that. Like, you can look at a person and know what their gender is. I was taught that. And it's something I'm continually unlearning. I'll invite you to unlearn with me that gender attribution is something we do when we look at someone and we take our best guess, but it really is a guess and it's not accurate, and we can't know somebody's gender unless they tell us, really. Great. So these things are different and not the same. So gender identity is not the same as gender expression, which is certainly not the same as gender attribution. All right, so I want to talk just briefly about this idea of the binary. So I've already talked a little bit about the gender binary. So any binary is the idea that there's 2 and only 2 options. They're mutually exclusive and they're opposites. So I would love to hear either in the chat or you can unmute yourself to think of some binaries that exist in our world, maybe not even related to what we're talking about in this presentation, but some things that you hear like blank or blank that are, there's 2 and only 2, they're mutually exclusive, ideas of some binaries we hear about.
Jewish and non-Jewish.
Great, Jewish and non-Jewish, left and right. dog or cat person, Democrat or Republican, up and down, white and person of color. Great. Okay, these are really good examples. I love the Jewish and not Jewish thing, right? It's like they're mutually exclusive. There's only two options. The dog or the cat person, right? There's only two options, and they're mutually exclusive. But when we stop to think about these binaries, which are sort of shortcuts that our brain takes, like I'm going to take the dog or cat person one, right? Like, sure, maybe I have some friends who really like dogs, but they don't hate cats, right? Or maybe somebody who has a cat, but they're not actually a cat person. Or maybe somebody who loves dogs and cats and parakeets and hamsters, right? So these, dead or alive. Okay, I'm gonna leave that one. Okay, Schrodinger's cat. Okay, dead and alive, right? We don't know. Okay, I was a dog person. Now I was a dog person, but now I'm a cat person, right? Like these things shift over time. They're really not as mutually exclusive and opposites as we sometimes think of them. So I bring this up, bagels and kugels, right? Are you a bagel person or a kugel person, right? So I bring this up because I think that it's easy for folks to kind of break down those other binaries. Like, yeah, cat and dog person, that's not really like a real thing that exists in stone, right? That can be fluid and that can be shifting. And the same is true also when we talk about gender. So man and woman, while sure, I was definitely brought up to think those are totally separate and polar opposites and everyone fits into one of the two, it's really not that simple. Like, it's really not that simple. People are much more complicated, and there are billions of people on this planet, and so how could they all be categorized into one of two categories? So this is just to remind us of these categories that young folks these days are certainly kind of deconstructing, and that, you know, are likely to come up in your classrooms and when we think about identities and things like that. Questions about binaries? I love the binaries coming in the chat. Great. All right. Okay. All right. So take a deep breath. We've come to the end of our terms and concepts section. It was a lot of information. Y'all have done great. And I just want to return for a moment to our tree analogy. It is not expected that you all are mature oaks at this point. Absolutely not. I think that we're always growing and we're always learning. Maybe you're one step closer to being a mature oak, and that's great. And we're going to provide a lot of resources for you to continue this learning if you are interested after today, because the learning does not end today. All right, so moving into the sort of most important things that we're actually going to talk about today, which is about putting it into practice. So we have a quote up here from the Talmud that says, "The sages say, study is greater than action, but only because study leads to action." So the purpose of today, again, is not to have all these definitions memorized, is not to be able to go into your classroom and be like, cisgender, bisexual man, like transgender, genderqueer. No, like that is, the idea is not to be able to categorize everyone and understand all the nuances. It's so that we can now move forward and talk about how to create welcoming spaces. So we're going to put that study into action. I also am going to say that Dubs needs to leave in 1 minute. So thank you, Dubs, so much for joining us. You can feel free to keep adding the questions and such to the chat. I might be a little bit slower to respond to them. All right. So let me pull up my chat as I say that. Yes, thanks, Dubs. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about norms and assumptions. So sometimes the assumptions, behaviors, traditions, and expectations of one group are assumed to be universal or objective. This usually happens without intent or without planning. It just sort of happens when assumptions become norms. But what happens then is that we risk building things and creative programs or speaking in ways that are not accessible and welcoming of everybody. So one example of this assumptions becoming norms thing is when we think about the US and our calendar. So the Gregorian calendar, right? Christian holidays, Christmas, Easter, they're often considered federal holidays, and workplaces are closed. If you work at Beth Tikva congregation, you maybe have a different experience, but for folks who don't work in Jewish institutions, it's sort of assumed that Christian is the norm. Christian is the baseline, and so those days, Christmas, Easter, are given as days off. That works for many people, but then people of other faiths then need to use, like a personal day or a vacation day for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur, for other religious or faith traditions that they hold that are not Christian. So this is just one example of the way that an assumption, the assumption is kind of like, most people are Christian, right, becomes a norm that then impacts a lot of people, and what is considered the default. People with me on assumptions and norms? Okay. So to apply that to what we're talking about today, we have two more vocab words. I'll start with heteronormativity, the yellow word on the right. So this comes from heterosexual, like straightness. So heteronormativity is the assumption that by default, everyone is straight. Everyone is heterosexual, and we're sort of going to operate centering that experience and assuming that by default, people are straight. Cisnormativity, that's around cisgender, that word that we learned earlier, which is sort of an antonym to transgender. So cisgender is someone whose gender identity aligns with what they were assigned at birth. Cisnormativity is the assumption that by default, people are cisgender. So seeing that as the baseline. So there might be exceptions, there might be things that we accommodate, but the norm, the baseline, the default is straight and cisgender. So to make this a little more concrete, I'm wondering if folks can, either in the chat or aloud, share an example of cisnormativity or heteronormativity, either just in your own personal life or maybe at Beth Tikva congregation, an example so we can really understand what we're talking about with these things. So I'll start by sharing one example, and maybe that'll get your, okay, great. Oh, great, okay. So thank you. So we have gender reveal parties, right. Okay, so gender reveal parties are an example of cisnormativity, right? People like set off an explosive device and it blows blue smoke and maybe sets a forest on fire, but people say, oh, it's a boy. So that is assuming that just because that person has had an ultrasound or a blood test or whatever and sees that that little baby, that little fetus, excuse me, I have a cat here, has a penis, assuming that that person will identify as a boy. So that is cisnormativity, great example. Boys playing sports, okay, so that is, that's an example of sort of some strict gender roles and assumptions.
May I ask a question here? So thinking about Beth Tikva examples, and this isn't exclusive to Beth Tikva, and I don't think it is even including Beth Tikva today, but certainly in the past, Beth Tikva had a policy that if one was to participate in the service on the Bima, if you were a man, you had to wear a kippah. So I'm using the definition man and the word man and kippah because that's what we're talking about. Were at the time. What is this an example of? Which or either or both of these is that an example of? And by the way, if somebody didn't do so or perceived not to be doing so, they would be approached and told you have to wear one. So there's assumptions being made. Again, where would you put that?
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you for raising that, Scott. The question of like mandating men to wear a kippah, and if you see someone you perceive to be a man not wearing a kippah, you approach them and say, excuse me, you need to wear a kippah. I think that falls near cisnormativity, and I'm really glad you brought that up because that is a real thing. I'll use an example from my life. I was at a year ago, I was at High Holiday Services with my partner, who is transgender, who is non-binary. They're not a man and they're not a woman. They have short hair, kind of like me. And they were approached exactly like you said, because somebody saw them and thought they were a man and said, you need to wear a kippah. And of course, that was not maliciously intended at all, but this is where we get to the intent versus impact, right? Because that was at the very beginning of Rosh Hashanah services, or it might have been Yom Kippur. Okay, that was at the beginning of Yom Kippur services. We then had to very uncomfortably sit for several hours feeling like, oh gosh, we're being looked at. Somebody just made this assumption. They didn't really know how to handle people like us. And we feel uncomfortable. And now we're like really distracted. You know, we were already distracted because we were fasting and it's Yom Kippur, but that's a great example that actually happens all the time of making an assumption when you see someone of how they should be dressing. Great, so I see some other examples in the chat that are really great. So asking somebody, maybe you meet a new woman congregant and you say, oh, and where's your husband? Okay, that's an example of heteronormativity, assuming that this woman is going to have a husband. Or you meet a new rabbi. I hear this one sometimes. You meet a new rabbi who's a man and you say, oh, and where's the Rebbitzin? And like the rabbi is married to a man, right? There's not a Rebbitzin. Giving Kiddush cups to the boys and giving candlesticks to the girls at a bar mitzvah, as opposed to just asking like, which gift would you prefer, right? Great. Asking parents, asking a pregnant person if they know what the gender of their baby is, right? Is it a boy or is it a girl? That's often the first question that's ever asked about us when we're fetuses. That's often the first question. Great. Asking someone you've just met who you perceive to be a woman, are you married? What does your husband do? Great. Telling a student, have your mom and dad look over your work, rather than having your adults at home look over this or having your parents look over this, right? Assuming that all families have a mom and a dad. That's a really, really important one. Great. Yes, great example that impacts everyone is gender-specific bathrooms. Yeah, so having only a men's room and a women's room as bathrooms is a cis-normative assumption, because you're assuming everybody is going to feel comfortable in one of those two bathrooms, which is not true. Great. Great, great, great. Have your grown-up look over your work. Awesome. Okay, so these are really wonderful examples. And again, this is one of those tools that I want to give to you as you're looking over your curriculum, your language, all, your virtual classroom, all these things. Where are you seeing the assumption or the kind of default setting that everyone will be straight and cis norm and cis? Right. So these are really good sort of lenses. This is why we have a magnifying glass. Like I would love for everyone to go through your life with this magnifying glass of where are we seeing those assumptions. Great. I want to provide one more tool. We're not going to go through this in detail, but we can definitely do one example. So this is just a quick grid where you think of one activity or one instance, and what are the assumptions that are going into that? And what is the potential impact of that? So we can maybe choose one of the activities listed in the chat, or if somebody has another example that we could use to think through the assumptions and the impacts, maybe a Beth Tikva example.
I have an example.
Maybe we can do, great.
When I was growing up at Beth Tikva, we simulated a Jewish wedding as part of our Judaic study, and somebody had to be the bride and somebody had to be the groom, and so that was like a part of our learning.
Great, thanks, Becca. So glad to have that example. That's really, really helpful. So if we think of this example that Becca just gave of sort of like a mock wedding, when young ones are learning about Jewish weddings, and having a mock wedding in the classroom and having a bride and a groom, as of course this is how our Jewish wedding is going to look. What are the assumptions here that are at play?
bride will be a girl in the class and the groom will be a boy. Like that's going to be the gender assumptions that we're going to assume based on the activity.
The rabbi
So
will
there's
be,
one, great. So there's one assumption that like the bride has to be played by a girl and the groom needs to be played by a boy, for sure. I heard something else from Mandy.
Yes, I said that the rabbi would be male.
Okay, there might be an assumption that the rabbi is a man. There's assumption that a girl will wear a gown and the boy will wear a suit. Okay. And so for little kiddos in that classroom who are maybe transgender or gender creative or gender fluid, what is the potential impact on those kiddos seeing this happening in front of their classroom?
They may not be able to imagine themselves as going through this Jewish ritual event.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Becca. Yes, and in the chat, they feel like Jewish weddings don't apply to them. Yeah, maybe they think, oh, this is a Jewish wedding. I don't see myself there. I can't get married.
Can I play
Feeling very
devil's advocate,
uncomfortable.
though? Can I
Sure,
play
Rachel.
devil's advocate though? Isn't it okay sometimes to have a wedding with a man and a woman?
Absolutely. So it is absolutely okay to have that as an example.
Okay.
I think, yes, I think where it gets sticky and can be harmful is when that's the only example. Because when we're shown one example, at least what I think of, when I'm shown one example, I think, oh, that's the way it is. That's the only way it is. If I'm shown 3 different examples and they all look very different, then I'm like, oh, it can look like A, it can look like B, it can look like C, it can look like something else. So absolutely, it should be one of many options.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I agree with that 100 and a
Yeah.
million%. I agree that there should be many options.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. Great. Okay, so great. We've just talked about gender, how this could be impacting folks. What are the sexual orientation assumptions here in this example of a mock Jewish wedding?
If I was the teacher and I happened to assign those rather than ask for volunteers, I think I would be afraid. Now I would be afraid that I assume that they were cis-normative and heteronormative.
Yeah, Essie, I think that's a really good point. Maybe we could speak briefly about how a teacher might invite populating these activities with our students and what it is we could be saying that's different than what we're doing now.
Totally. So I think that there is
Essie, so as I only feel I need to, I hope I don't sound defensive because I'm not really, but as many of the people know, the mock wedding situation was always, it has been for the last many years in the class that I have taught, which is a 7th grade class, just to give you the background quickly, 7th grade class, and it's I'm hoping this was understood, but it's not a Jewish wedding. It's not thought that this is a Jewish wedding. It's the class is a class on Jewish history, and it's taught during the period of learning about shtetl life, and it's taught more as this was the way a wedding happened in the shtetl, and in some aspects of this, maybe today by some, especially if they are Orthodox Jews, but looks very different from what we might see at a wedding at Beth Tikva. And we talk about that, and most people, most Jewish kids who have had any experience understanding weddings have no experience understanding this, what we were calling a shtetl wedding. And so even more recent, first of all, it was never assigned characters as such. Someone who might be playing the rabbi or playing the matchmaker or playing the bride or the groom or whatever, they were characters. And more recently, I've tried very hard to make sure that we understand that they're each playing characters. And it doesn't matter who plays what character, but they are assuming a role. But I see that it can be a difficult situation regardless of that. But I just want to lay that out there, that that's what we're really talking about in the Beth Tikva situation.
Great. Thank you. Rabbi, I see your hand. Thanks so much for clarifying that, Scott. Rabbi, did you have something to add? And then I have some thoughts.
I mean it just as a, like an open, honest question. And in particular, this is a great example. I think that as you're saying, that there are so many different aspects of identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, that there's so much to it. I mean, that whole circle, race, ability, age, gender, sexuality, all of those things, like, how is it ever possible to not offend someone in with that whole circle of different ways that we identify? How, so sorry if it sounds like, it's like, sorry, do we not do anything because there's going to be someone who feels that they are not present or welcomed in that setting?
Great. So these are some really good points. I want to circle back to the wedding for just a moment. That's really helpful to clarify that this is like an example of a shtetl wedding. I think that to answer somebody's question earlier around how could we do this activity more inclusively, I think something Scott brought up of like anyone can play any of these roles. So not assigning, not saying little Betty, you're going to be the bride and little Johnny, you're going to be the groom, saying like who would like to play part A and who would like to play part B, and letting anybody play any part. And afterwards having that discussion Scott was talking about of like, this looks pretty different, right? That looks pretty different from what we might see today. What might we see today at a wedding at Beth Tikva? Yes, we might see 2 grooms. Yes, we might see 2 brides. Yes, we might see people who, whatever it is, look different, who like maybe have been married before already and are getting married for a second time, right? Like bringing in all these different examples so that kids really do get the idea of like, this was history, this is how it might have looked, and now things look very different and there's more options for me now, right? So that they can see themselves represented. The question around, won't somebody always be offended? So I will say, like in Jewish communal life, like you could change the color of the carpet and someone will be offended, right? You can like change the wall color and someone will have a problem with it.
Well,
so that is
the wall color.
Yes, it's important, the color of the carpet. So that is a truth of being in community, right? Not everybody is going to be happy all the time. And I think that's really important to note, especially when we think about, what if we change the way we did this wedding lesson and people got mad, right? Somebody is going to be mad no matter what. But in terms of having representation and thinking about identities, I think to some extent, yes, you're never going to speak to every single identity out there. I think that is true. And I think it's our responsibility as educators to show as many representations as we can and different experiences as we can. And even thinking about who sees themselves represented out in the broader world, on TV, in books, in movies, what experiences are lifted up and we see all the time, and which ones we don't see all the time and are not talked about, and maybe even putting some special emphasis on uplifting those experiences and voices to counteract that misbalance of representation, I think is really important. So I think all that we can do is be as inclusive and expansive as we can, but sure, there still might be a kid in your class who says, well, what about my family who looks different than that? Or what about my, gender expression that I don't see represented there? And I think it's also our responsibility to listen to those experiences, acknowledge if we've caused hurt inadvertently, and strive to do better. All right, so we have about 11 minutes left.
Can I add something to this conversation? Just something small about
please. And then I'm going to move us forward.
Right. Just because I've never been, and I'm so glad to hear how Scott incorporates all of this discussion into that activity. But I think what's interesting when we talk about heteronormativity and those assumptions that are made, what I've experienced, because I've never been a part of that, but I've always been in the building when it was happening for the last 13 years. And what I'm experiencing from being outside and looking, being outside and looking on the inside, is that the whole building seems to get excited around this mock wedding every year. And I hear adults and parents and teachers and people saying, oh, who's the bride? Oh, who's the groom? Because we all get excited that our children are learning this and it's a fun activity. So that's where I experience the heteronormativity assumptions. In the building, is everybody getting excited? And I think that's an interesting thing that we could all be aware of.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so just to go back to this for a moment, again, we just ran through sort of one quick example, but this is a tool you can use with other lessons, with other books that you're reading, with movies you're showing, whatever, just thinking through how this might impact people whose experiences are not straight and cisgender. Great. All right, so I'm gonna go quickly for the next few slides, but I am going to send this out to you, or to Mandy and Rocky, and send out to you these slides afterwards, so you can go through at your own pace. But again, when you're thinking about that magnifying glass, right, or that last table that we filled out a little bit together, some places to apply those frameworks are programming. So what you do, that's probably a lot of what religious school teachers are thinking about. Policy, how we do it or how we say we do it, and culture, the environment in which we do it. So for example, programming. Do you have LGBTQ specific programming? Do you uplift any LGBTQ holidays and observances? Do you include LGBTQ or gender neutral content? So thinking about the historical figures that you talk about, I know we just talked about a shtetl wedding. There are also some beautiful, we have really amazing historical figures who were Jewish and LGBTQ. Are you highlighting those voices? Are you including those amongst all the other maybe straight and cisgender normative? Are you including this variety of representation? Can LGBTQ members, students, staff, participants access a social or professional affinity group, right? Are there spaces for LGBTQ folks to be going? Yes, these slides will be available. I will send them to Rocky, who can send them out. So policy, I know as religious school teachers, this might be a little bit above your pay grade, but thinking about your anti-bullying policies, if you have one for your classroom, thinking about those ground rules you set up at the beginning of the year, are you thinking about how different people with different experiences are going to be respected and seen in this space? Written policies around using facilities, right? I know that's a little not so much on the forefront because we're not in the building. Thinking about some security practices around IDs and legal names, again, maybe back burner for when we're back in the building. And then, education and ongoing education about these issues. Culture is about how are people going to know that they will be seen and welcome and that they belong. So, in a physical classroom, maybe that looks like a sign on the door. Online, maybe that looks like using your virtual background kind of creatively and having a safe zone sticker. Maybe it looks like having your pronouns, which we're going to talk about really briefly in just a minute, on your Zoom name. If you look at my Zoom name, I have my pronouns written in my name. You can do that as well. You can also, you'll see Deb has hers also. You can also put that in your email signature, right? Thinking about what are the pictures you're using, right? When you're talking about Jewish weddings, what do the couples look like? When you're reading children's books, what do the families in the children's book look like? Are you having these conversations in your community? Again, what stories and authors and themes are you uplifting? All right, some specifics for you in the classroom. The first one is allowing self-identification, so letting people identify how they want to. So not assuming, that you're a boy, you're a girl, you're a boy, you're a girl, but letting people self-identify. Avoiding separating by gender. So when I was a little kid, it was like boys on this side, girls on this side. It's really boring and also can be harmful because it can exclude people. And it also sends a really strong message. Even if it's not excluding anyone, it sends a very strong message that binary gender as opposites is like very, very important, and that we must keep these two groups separate. So send strong messages to everybody. So instead you could say, okay, this group is for people who like latkes, and this group is for people who prefer susganyot, or something like that. Cat people and dog people, right? Those binaries we talked about earlier. So if a young person is out to you, meaning they're open about, you know, being LGBTQ to you, don't assume that they are out in all contexts. So privacy for young people is really, really important. It's okay to ask a young person like, oh, how confidential is this information? Who can I talk to about it? Maybe they came out to you because you're their really awesome woke religious school teacher, but maybe they're not out to maybe even their own parents or maybe other people in the congregation. So it's really important to maintain confidentiality, making sure that activities are available to everyone. So not giving, you know, the pink, the pink coloring pages to the girls and the blue coloring pages to the boys, but making sure anyone can have either the pink or the blue or the green one. We talked about bullying policies here, and keep educating yourself. So you can use Google, you can use Keshet's webpage. All right. I'll send out these resources afterwards, but there are some awesome, Brad, I see you. Just one sec. There's some really awesome resources if you want to directly address these things with the young people. So I would highly recommend Queer Kids Stuff. It's a YouTube series. There's a screen cap here of one that's What is Judaism? So they talk about all different kinds of identities, including religion and Judaism, which is really, really cool. I want to take Brad's question.
Thank you. Hi, Essie. It's great to see you. I just wanted to ask, what does Keshet do, or what is your guidance about societal and in other schools, public schools, where they purposely are breaking up the kids into gender-specific groups? And we see this all the time. My own children, you know, for health classes, for gym classes, for bathroom breaks, all kinds of stuff. Clearly those are providing those cues that you're talking about. And it's something that we do deal with also at Beth Tikva from time to time. But what's a good way to advocate on behalf of, like, you know, a better way to do that? Or are there times when that's appropriate and that's what should be?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think generally in those examples, it's not actually necessary. So thinking about health class, I think it's important for people to know what's going on with all different kinds of bodies, right? Not just the body that they have, but other people's bodies. So I think that sometimes having separated classes and groups for that actually increases shame and secrecy sometimes. So I think that there can be times when it is appropriate. Like maybe it makes sense to, I don't know, meet with the people who are having a bar mitzvah and meeting with the people who are having a bat mitzvah and meeting with people who are having a b mitzvah or a b'nai mitzvah, right? Maybe that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. I think it really depends on the situation. But I think that it's often a default of like, oh, of course we're going to separate this with boys and girls. But then when you actually investigate why, there's not actually a good reason. So I think it's asking that underlying question. So I do see that we have 1 minute left. I think I'm not going to try and get into pronouns right now because 1 minute is not enough time, but I will send you this presentation. It does have notes in the presenter section, and so you can read all about this, and I'll send you further resources. So I will just hang out for questions for a few minutes and want to thank you all. I know this was a lot of information. You can absolutely feel free to be in touch. But are there any questions for the next few minutes?
Essie, if I could bother you with a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in the power of words personally, and I teach Hebrew, so that's a double whammy. And I have had situations in the class before where the kids have asked me what is the nomenclature in Hebrew. And in my experience, I haven't lived in Israel for quite a while now, so I'm probably well behind the times. But at least when I lived there, the vocabulary around LGBTQ in Israel was extremely derogatory. And those aren't words that I would like to be teaching my kids. So do you have a resource that you could give me to find more up-to-date, more positive terminology?
Yes, I would be happy to give you resources on that. I will also provide resources on gender neutral Hebrew, which is sort of a newer project of folks who are, creating new systems so that there's like non-gendered Hebrew, and also I'll send some resources on ways that some summer camps and youth movements are adapting the language. So I'll be happy to send that out.
Thank you.
All right, I don't want to eat into any more of your time, but I just want to say thank you so much. Feel free to be in touch with follow-up questions. I know we didn't get to everything today, but thanks for sticking with me, and best of luck with this very unusual year.
Thank you so much.